Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But you know, KSJE is now listener-supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast. 10 minutes past 8 o'clock. It is Thursday morning, the 6th day of August, 2026. Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott Michlin. Thanks for tuning in to KSJE 90.9 FM right here in San Juan County, New Mexico. In Durango, Colorado, we broadcast at 103.3 FM to your radios. And if you're listening to my voice anywhere else on the planet, that means you may have gone to our website, ksje.com, to listen, or listening through the KSJE radio app, or maybe your smart speaker is playing KSJE. It's great to have you all with us. However you found your way to listen this morning. Also, welcome to our viewers, the folks who are watching me right now. The video of this program is streaming out live to the KSJE Facebook page and also to our YouTube channel. So we have a lot of folks joining us this morning, and it's a good thing, too, because coming up in the next few moments, my guest today, archaeologist Paul Reed. He works, of course, with Archaeology Southwest. He's done extensive work here in the region at Selman Ruins and Aztec Ruins and Chaco Canyon. The list goes on, but we are talking about an important event in the history of the Southwest before New Mexico became a state, but in the New Mexico area, of course, and that is the Pueblo Revolt that began around this time in August of 1680. So stay tuned for that. We're going to get Paul Reed's thoughts on the Pueblo Revolt and what that means to him and his colleagues, and we'll talk more about that in the next few moments right here on KSJE this morning. We'll make way then next hour for Mick Hess, who'll take us roving with the arts. That's our weekday classical music program. It's coming up today at 9:06 right here on KSJE. A reminder, you can also connect with us on other forms of social media if that's your thing. You can find us over at Instagram, Blue Sky, X, and now Nextdoor, in addition to Facebook and YouTube. And, of course, we publish KSJE podcasts almost every day. You can subscribe to them wherever you listen to podcasts and discover a new local program in your feed, or better yet, just get the KSJE radio app. It's now available at the App Store and on Google Play. Podcasts are right there in the app for you. You can listen live and much, much more. It's all part of the KSJE radio app. Outside our studios here at San Juan College, it is another hot and hazy Thursday morning. Smoke still in the area from some regional wildfires. 71 degrees at the moment. It's going to be another hot and sunny day today. Another heat advisory in effect for the region. Sunshine, 96 for a high. I think it's going to hit over 100 again today, so we'll see how that goes. Overnight clear sky, 64 for a low. But in the next several days, take a look at Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Sunshine, another heat advisory, I'm sure, for the next 3 days with highs each day, 97 in the area, and overnight lows near 70 degrees. A bit cooler on Monday, maybe some clouds moving in Tuesday, Wednesday, with a chance of some showers Monday night and Tuesday night and Wednesday night. We'll see if that monsoon pattern develops next week. I'll be back with my guest, archaeologist Paul Reed, right after this on KSJE. KSJE is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center. It's physician-led and supported by specialists, so patients can receive the treatment they need right here at home. When every minute matters, dedicated caregivers are here for you. San Juan Regional Medical Center, serving the Four Corners region for generations. Find out more at sanjuanregional.com.
Now back to Studio A and the award-winning Scott Michlin morning program on KSJE.
I'm back in the studio this morning, and once again, we'd like to welcome our guest who is joining us remotely today. Paul Reed is here. Of course, he works with Archaeology Southwest, as I had mentioned, and there he is. I'm sure he'd much rather be inside on a day like today than out working in the field when it's 90-plus degrees. Paul, good morning.
Morning, Scott. Glad to be back on. And yes, it is nice to be out of the heat. It's been pretty hot.
Right, right. Well, and this makes sense as to why you do a lot of your field work in the spring and fall. I would say that makes perfect sense these days, right?
My preference for sure is not to be out in June, July, and August, but somehow every year I end up being out.
Something
So
happens.
that's okay too.
Understood. Well, it's a passion of yours, I know. But it's great to have you here to talk a bit about this topic that we came up with. You came up with it, the Pueblo Revolt, which, as I mentioned, started around this time in August of the year 1680. It is somewhat very significant, not just somewhat significant, because it is one of the examples, I guess, of a successful revolt against Indigenous people, and there's a lot of underlying stories to it. And certainly from an archaeologist point of view, I know folks in your line of work have studied this for years and years to learn more about it and what happened and things like that, correct?
Right, right. Pueblo Revolt is really, I think, marked in history as the only successful insurrection against a European power in North America that had some legs to it. So, it was in 1680, as you noted, August 11th and 12th, and then that lasted until 1692. So it was about 12 years for Pueblo people in New Mexico primarily, but also over at Hopi in Arizona to push back against Spanish rule and really, have reclaim what was theirs for about a dozen years.
Right, right. You shared an article with me from, let's see, let me find it here, and I'll put it up, and we can kind of take a look from the Archaeologist magazine. That's what it was. They call it the First American Revolution, which goes into great detail a little bit about it and some of the archaeological work around some of the sites. But it certainly is one of those moments in history, right, that gets a lot of attention because of what you were saying, right? This revolt that lasted not just a few months, but a few years.
Right, correct. The Spanish, of course, had come into the Southwest initially with Coronado between 1539 and about 1541. And then there were waves of other, groups of explorers, folks coming up, and then colonization in 1598. And so then we had an extended period of almost 100 years, 80 some years of Spanish rule. And really, I think from the perspective of the Pueblos and other indigenous folks, a lot of very oppressive requirements in terms of building massive churches, farming and providing a whole lot of different goods to the Spanish rulers. And folks finally got to the point where they had had enough. The revolt was organized by an amazing leader whose name was Pope. His father was from Okeawinge Pueblo, just a few miles south of here, and his mom actually was from Taos Pueblo. So he organized this revolt and had originally planned it for a couple of days before, but they had a very clever system of, coordinating with the many, many Pueblos. At this point, there's only 20 New Mexico Pueblos, along with Isleta del Sur down in Texas, plus the Hopi Pueblos. At this point in 1680, there was dozens, and so they had knotted cords that they had, organized with, his closest followers. Those were handed out. And then as, leaders in different pueblos were supposed to untie those knotted cords. And when they were out of knots, that was the signal then to, rise up.
Interesting. That was going to be one of my questions for you, was about, the communication, because certainly, to get word back then, 1680, we're talking runners and things like that, I guess, pretty much to get messages from Pueblo to Pueblo separated by hundreds of miles.
Right, exactly. And, and the Pueblos, and other indigenous folks across America have had a long history of running as, the main way to get messages passed. And of course, in our modern communication era, it's a little hard sometimes for us to imagine. But yeah, they would basically have tag teams of individuals who would run distances up to 10 miles or more and be able to pass messages, information, certainly, some trade goods, etc. And these were systems that were well established way before any European presence in North America. So yeah, it really was an extraordinarily well-coordinated event, and by all accounts, really caught the Spanish rulers and across the northern Southwest by surprise. And essentially the Spanish retreated to, what's today the city of El Paso, and, didn't return until 1692.
Right, and the fact that this was coordinated, right, at most of these, if not all of these pueblos, right, and so that was part of the other, I guess, shock and awe, if you will, of what this meant to the Spanish, and as they kind of figured out what was going on, not just in their close proximity, but also throughout their kind of region that they controlled, they were getting the word back, and that, I guess, was the word for their retreat because they were trying to figure out just how big of a revolt they had on their hands, I suppose.
Right. And, and again, from the historic accounts, both the Indigenous side and the Spanish side, I think the Spanish were very surprised by what had happened. There had certainly been hints at different points in the 1660s and 1670s that Pueblo people, other Indigenous people living in the area, were really chafing under the, just to be honest, Scott, the very brutal rule and the extraction of resources and labor that was part of the Spanish system in the Southwest. And, folks really had enough and they rose up. They were very well organized at this point. And one of the things that I think we look at in different periods as we're trying to understand Pueblo history and other Indigenous histories is there's a tendency to view villages as these largely self-autonomous, self-sufficient units that didn't coordinate with each other. And I think that is really a mistaken notion as we look back. Of course, this is well after Chaco, but, with the Chacoan system that spread across 4 modern states, in quite a large area, we saw close coordination, trade, other economics, transportation, social aspects, certainly religious, cosmological aspects. So I think, from the Spanish point of view, they had come to look at these different villages as these separate units. They put things in place to keep people from moving around as much as they had, migrating, circulating. They tried to do that. But again, the revolt really revealed the depths of what we could call a pan-Pueblo organization, a political organization, a social organization. So from that standpoint, they probably should have maybe been a little more aware of it. But really looking at it from the Pueblo point of view, that's one reason why it was so successful, was some of the surprise that, came upon the Spanish as these groups pursued this agenda.
And the fact that it was so successful and lasted for over a decade, I mean, again, and that's somewhat unheard of as well, right? That it took the Spanish 10 years plus to figure out how to regain control or how to try to regain their empire as they had it here in what is now New Mexico.
That's right. And, one of the things that did happen, so, there were 2 periods of reconquest, one in 1692 that wasn't fully successful, and then another in 1696 under an individual named de Vargas. And, so what happened at that point is many of the Pueblo folks fled their villages in more vulnerable areas, the mountains around Jemez, filled with a lot of Pueblo refugees, other points of refuge, here and there, up in the Dinatah, just east of Farmington. Folks fled for periods of time. Folks went out to Hopi, which was more remote. So we had a large translocation of people. But the other thing that happened in the succeeding years of the late 1690s into the 1700s was a change in Spanish policy. And, I think in some ways, I think it's fair to say that at least some of the Spanish colonial governors and, the government in the New World in Mexico City took the lesson, if you will. And I think to some extent, there was less repression and slightly better situation evolved for people living under Spanish rule. I don't want to overstate that, certainly, and many of my Pueblo and Indigenous colleagues, would bring different perspectives to this. But I think looking at it from, as much as we're able to do this with, an objective or historical look, we would see that, yes, it was successful for the dozen years. And then in the succeeding century plus, all the way up to Mexican independence in 1821, there were changes in the way the Spanish ruled, this part of the world.
Right. And the article that you sent Paul Reed talks a little bit about, what we know of the Pueblo Revolt. A lot of it certainly originally came from the Spanish side and their records and things like that. But there's been more work that's been done by folks in your line of work on an archaeology basis, right, to talk more and look at these sites and talk to the Pueblos, the current day Pueblos, a bit more to add to the story. Is that kind of where we're getting a lot of maybe newer interpretations of what happened or what changed with Pueblo rules and Spanish rules and things like that during this era? Oh, Paul, can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely correct, Scott. And the other thing that we've got now, I think, is, well, as we've talked on the show, for a few years now, we have many more Native scholars, Pueblo scholars, doing this kind of research, and it really is broadening our understanding of the Pueblo Revolt. We're not looking at it strictly from an historical document basis or sort of a scientific archaeological perspective, but we're bringing to light, Pueblo scholars are bringing to light, their stories, their people's stories about what happened during this time. And I think this can only enrich the understanding that we have. And honestly, again, as we've talked many times, Scott, really sort of equal out some of the biases that we bring as non-Indigenous people talking about different points in the Indigenous past and in history.
Exactly. And Paul, I wanted to ask you too, during the time that immediately after the revolt in that decade, 12 years, 15 years or so, there was really pretty much it was independence for these Pueblos, these indigenous peoples across New Mexico, right? There was no other, I mean, they were doing what they'd always done, which was kind of self-governing and trading and communicating with the other Pueblos like before, but there was no really European influence during that 10, 15 years.
Right. So there was a return to many traditional Pueblo practices. And in particular, one of the things that was, I think, particularly damaging for Indigenous people in North America was different European groups really suppressing Native or Indigenous religion. And this is something that happened in the Southwest in a huge way. So many Pueblo and other Indigenous ceremonies, had to be hidden from the Spanish or they would be, terribly repressed. People were brought up on charges of heresy. There was some very serious brutality and terrible repression of that. So this period of time gave folks a chance to return to some of those practices and begin to reclaim some of what they had before the Spanish presence.
And the significance of Black Mesa a little bit with this story. Can you talk a bit about that and some of the work that archaeologists have done in and around that site in New Mexico?
Well, right. This is, one of the important places because this is very close to the current Pueblos of Okeowinge. And again, that was the home Pueblo for the leader Popey, also close to the Pueblos of Santa Clara and San Ildefonso. So this is an area that was used as a staging area and was very important as leaders, really who came out of the northern reaches of the Pueblo world. So up here with what is today the 6 Tewa-speaking villages, and again led by Popey and Okeowinge, these groups organized this and planned this, and there has been some recent archaeology at some of these sites, which is helping archaeologists really and Pueblo people understand that history better.
And it was on the Mesa, Paul, am I understanding correctly? The Pueblo fighters kind of held off or at least had a siege with the Spanish a little bit, but it lasted for days or weeks?
Right. At this particular point, many Pueblo people took refuge, and when the Spanish returned in force, this happened all over the northern Southwest. As the Spanish came back intent on reclaiming this territory, people fled to elevated defended positions like Black Mesa, and again, other spots in the Jemez Mountains to the west, which was more remote and harder to get to for sure, up in Denatah. And so the Spanish brought different military expeditions during this time to try to bring people back under their rule.
And from your standpoint, Paul, from an archaeology standpoint, I mean, what are some of the newer, I guess, maybe understandings or discoveries from some of the work that's been done at some of these sites about this time in our collective history? Are there any new insights that you've learned?
No, for sure, Scott. And I think what I feel like, as a scholar who, doesn't specialize in this particular time period, but of course I'm very interested and fascinated by it. I think we're really understanding more of the nuance. So a lot of times, and this is certainly true in any topic, really almost any field that we might talk about, there's kind of the broad level. We can think of it as the highest part of our understanding, kind of the mid-level, and then sort of getting down into, our term for today is getting into the weeds. So really, from my perspective, the best way to understand historical events is to be able to control those three levels and potentially others. And then, of course, in a lot of the work that we do at Archaeology Southwest, try to come to an understanding and be able to speak about that, and not have everything turn into a 3-hour lecture, for example. But for me, the nuance of understanding how different Pueblo groups withheld, the Spanish returning and basically sustain themselves in the face of these sieges, is adding a lot of rich detail to this. And, we tend to sort of think about things as well. This event happened August 10th, 11th, 12th, 1680. The Spanish left, they retreated down to El Paso, they stayed away. Pueblo people went back to their way of life. Well, of course, much more complicated than that, because by that point in time, Pueblo people, Pueblo farmers were now growing cotton, and there was cotton in the ancient past for sure, but they were growing a lot more cotton. They had other crops, they had fruit trees, which hadn't been introduced, weren't available, except in different wild forms before that. So there was already a pretty big transformation as people tried to reclaim their lives. And then, not unexpectedly, the Spanish came back in force. Well, the Pueblos had folks out scouting and, were aware of this and were able to try to get folks to safety. But, there were definitely, and this is always the brutal part of any human conflict, lots of casualties. Many people lost their lives during the course of this. So I don't think we want to just look at it, though, either as, the Spanish army came sweeping back in 1692, and this was all some smooth reconquest, et cetera. No, it was, Pueblo people resisted for this time period from 1692 through the mid 1690s to 1696. And then, conflicts of different sorts continued into the 18th century, into the 1700s. So I think it helps to, if you will, kind of hold the elevator speech, if we want to talk about it that way.
Right. Well, we've lost. Nope. Go ahead, Paul.
Yep. This is the broad outline of this event, but then let's talk about a little more of the nuance and the detail. So, and, that's I think where we come to a deeper understanding, and we can view it then not just from the standpoint of, the Spanish or the European side, but really the much deeper Indigenous or Pueblo side.
Right, for sure, of course. And then you mentioned too, I think a little bit in the 1690s and beyond, that the Spanish came back with maybe a little bit better understanding maybe of these different peoples that they were dealing with, and certainly, conquering and things like that. But they didn't come back more brutal, or did they? I mean, what was the situation, I guess, in that 1690s and in the 1700s and things like that? I mean, was there a little bit more understanding from the Spanish, or they were just as brutal as before?
Well, I think it's a good question. I do think that some of the changes that we see in terms of what the Spanish required different pueblos to produce, right? They had to produce certain quantities of corn, cotton mantas, they had these requirements. They had to help rebuild some of the churches that had been burned during the revolt. But, what we do see in the record, and this is from Spanish historical records and some accounts as well, is a slightly less brutal, if we can qualify it that way, approach to this. It certainly wasn't something that on the Pueblo side, people welcomed the return and thought, oh, this is great. We're happy to be back here. But I think it was, again, thinking about the nuance, a slightly better situation. The other thing that did happen is after this period of time in the 1690s, 1700s, other indigenous groups, Comanche in particular, different Apache groups, Ute folks, from the north started to make their presence known more in the form of raiding different villages of both Spanish settlers, Pueblo people, other settled peoples. So in some sense, I think the changes that we see in the late 17th century and early 18th century relate to these other pressures. And I think the need for Pueblo people and Spanish people to be allied with each other. And that really did up the game a lot. We saw a lot of these villages, some of which had been depopulated, with the Spanish reconquest in the 1690s. Folks tried to settle there. Well, at this point, I'm thinking one area in particular known as the Galisteo Basin, which is just kind of south, a little southeast of Santa Fe. There was 12 to 14 major villages and thousands of people there. The revolt changed some of that in the reconquest, but then because those areas were out in more of a frontier area, tribes who had recently acquired firearms plus the horse, this really changed the dynamic in the Southwest. And many of those people fled the Galisteo Basin. Some went to Hopi, some joined other villages. So I guess what I'm trying to say in part is the old adage, in part, the enemy, okay, I just blew the quote, but basically, you're my enemy, but you're the enemy of my enemy, so now you're my friend, or
Right.
you're at least my frenemy. So I think what we do see in this very complicated historical time period is different alliances forming. And, I think the Spanish realized that the Pueblos were allies against some of these other groups that were coming in to take, crops, livestock, and unfortunately, traffic in humans as well. So anyway, a very dynamic situation. And what essentially happened then in the 1700s is we didn't have a return to many of the things that we saw in the 1600s, if that makes sense.
Sure, right. It does make sense, of course. And I guess the idea, too, in your line of work is that maybe in some of the Pueblo villages, or if they were rebuilt or things like that, even during that 10, 15-year independence era after the initial revolt, where they kind of built with more fortified, I guess, positions because of what had happened and things like that, and with the Spanish coming in decades earlier. Have you seen that?
Yeah, we definitely did see the rise during this time period of sites in much more defensive settings up on mesa tops, harder to get to, harder to certainly move people and water and supplies, etc. And folks were still in those settings, required to go down to access cornfields and their other agricultural areas. But we definitely see what we would describe as a settlement shift. One of the things about looking at how people relate to each other on the landscape is, in some ways, the larger your village is, the more protected you are, because if you have 5,000 or 6,000 people, and you do have warriors, young men typically, and older men who are going to defend your village, the more people you have, the better defended you are. And if we kind of think historically about this in terms of other pueblos, we have the Pueblo at Pecos, which is kind of the eastern outpost. This site was built, the best we can say, in the late 1200s, early 1300s, and people stayed at Pecos until 1838, when the remaining folks there migrated over to their relatives at Jemez Pueblo. So this site was in place for 500 years. It was a trading outpost. It had thousands of people during this time period, and sort of survived some of the onslaughts of different folks coming in to raid, and really was a survivor during this time period. Looking at Taos Pueblo as well, Taos has a history that started at some point in the 1200s, and then the site became very important as well as sort of the northern and easternmost outpost of Pueblo culture and society. And Taos as well had different complicated relationships. Raiding and trading is the way a scholar from a few decades ago, Edward Spicer, sort of described this very dynamic period of time, these decades in this history.
And it seems, too, that article talks a bit about some of the pottery, some of the other things that were being created at these pueblos, and there was kind of a shift after the revolt. Maybe not as much Spanish influence, but more getting back to traditional designs and materials and items.
That's right. And what we see, and this is something where really the work of Indigenous Pueblo scholars has helped is we see, really dramatic signs of resistance to Spanish rule in the way people were producing pottery and, encoding different geometric designs, other motifs into the pottery to say, we are Pueblo people and we have society, we have continuity, and we're putting this into our pottery. So, there's been really good scholarship in different ways, throughout the Spanish time period in the Southwest that Pueblo people and other indigenous people resisted the influences of the group that was dominating them and trying to continue to dominate them. So that's a particularly interesting aspect as well.
Interesting. Well, Paul, we are just about out of time. So before we do run out of time completely, any final thoughts on this really important part of New Mexico history, or New Mexico prehistory, as it were?
Well, I think it's the way I think about it, Scott, and we talk about this a lot on the show, is what's really interesting, the way we study history through the tools of archaeology, other historical techniques, and again, broadening these perspectives now over a few decades with the narratives, the understandings, the deep history that indigenous people, and in this case, Pueblo people, hold and haven't talked about in many ways. This just enriches things that we understand about this particular period of time and really just results in what I hope is a better understanding of this, for everyone to increase what we know about the past. And this is what I find particularly fascinating, because I don't see us ever, we go through processes, we publish, people give presentations, etc. We do tours, lots of videos, YouTube these days, but we're probably not going to say, okay, we figured it all out here, let's close the book, And that's a nice thing at this point in my career to see that we have, of course, lots and lots of younger folks, more diverse folks, indigenous scholars coming up and bringing very different perspectives to what we think we know and what we want to continue to learn about.
Very true. Very true. Well, and we're so grateful that there are folks like you who bring these things to our attention, and we can share them with our audiences and pick your brain a little bit from time to time, Paul Reed. So thank you for letting us do that.
Well, my pleasure, Scott, and thank you for continuing to have me on, talking about interesting things every month.
Indeed, they are interesting, and I appreciate it very much, and I've learned even more this morning. So thanks for bringing that to all of us today, and we'll see you again next month, Paul Reed.
Sounds great.
Take care. That's Paul Reed from Archaeology Southwest, of course, my guest here on KSJE. Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.